In this section, we are going to start, or in this recording, we are going to start our look at tissues. And one of the reasons why we're going to spend so much time, I think I've got at least 4 or 5 videos here on tissues, is simply because this is brand new material. When you look at what you studied in biology, it's all cell-based. So other than kind of giving lip service or mentioning what tissues are, you really haven't heard a lot about tissues. If you take a look at what we know, we've got about 200 different types of cells that exist within humans. And that's one level of study, are the cells, and that's the one you're probably most familiar with. But if I take those cells and look at the functions that they perform, I can actually group them. So the cells actually combine to form a tissue, which is a collection of specialized cells that perform a few specific functions. And we only have 4 types of tissue in the body: epithelial, connective, muscle, and neural. So what in this section we're going to do is we're going to talk about epithelial tissue first, and we're going to go through its different functions. And then in the next section we'll actually talk about how we classify epithelial tissue. So epithelial tissue includes things like epithelia. There's true epithelia, which covers our internal and external surfaces of our bodies. So the covering of the skin and linings that we have that are exposed to the outside. This would be our digestive tract, our respiratory tract, our reproductive, and our urinary tracts. Epithelial tissue also includes the glands, which are secreting cells. So they create some sort of product that we make. So how does epithelial tissue function? Epithelial tissue functions in terms of physical protection against things like abrasion, dehydration, and destruction. Epithelial tissue also controls permeability. And we're not just talking about substances entering and leaving cells, but also entering and leaving the body. Some types of epithelia are almost impermeable, almost nothing gets through, whereas other types are very permeable, even to large proteins that normally wouldn't be able to be transported. Epithelial tissue also provides sensation. In other words, they act as receptors and detect changes in our environment so that it can activate our nervous system so that we can respond to them. Epithelial tissue also produces specialized secretions through the glandular epithelium, which are groups of secreting cells, or individual gland cells that also can produce secretions on their own. So let's take a look at some of their characteristics when we're talking about epithelial tissue. The first one is that they are very tightly packed. In other words, you will see very little separation of the cells from one another. And this allows for them to provide effective protection, not only to each other, but the cells that lie beneath them. In order for them to be tightly packed, they have to be connected to one another, as well as to something that is called the basement membrane, which is basically a grouping of proteins that they attach to. We have 3 types of connections that we're going to take a very brief look at here. The first one is called the tight junction. And what happens in the tight junction is the lipid layers of the cell membranes are pulled together by membrane proteins that run through both cell membranes. It actually looks like they've almost been stitched together. These tight junctions are located in a region called adhesion belts. And these adhesion belts connect to the inside cytoskeleton, which gives the cells their shape. What these tight junctions do is they prevent the passage of water and other solutes between the cells, not only from cell to cell, but they also prevent them from squeezing down in between the cells to cells that lie below. This type of junction is very typical of cells that are exposed to harsh chemicals, like in our digestive tract. And here you can actually see a diagram of a tight junction. And you can can see if I was bringing in a harsh chemical from above, it would have a very hard time getting past this, simply based on the fact that, first of all, these two membranes are actually stitched together. And there's so many different types of stitching, it's very unlikely that it would get past all of this area. The second type of connection is called a gap junction. And these junctions allow rapid intercellular communication. And this is important in areas where we have to coordinate certain activities. What happens is the adjacent cells are held together with embedded proteins, and in the middle of these embedded proteins there is a narrow passageway that allows certain small molecules and ions to pass, and that allows the cells to communicate with each other. We find this in ciliated epithelia, cardiac and smooth muscle, and what this does is it allows a coordination of the movements with these cells. You'll see cilia, and the cilia have to move actually in a very coordinated fashion in order to function properly, and cardiac muscle and smooth muscle have to contract in a coordinated fashion in order to function properly. And in order to do that, they have to be able to communicate with each other. So this is a gap junction, and you can see it actually kind of looks like a small flower with the proteins around the outside and the little narrow passageway in the middle. The third type of connection is called a desmosome. This is where the cell membranes get locked together by intercellular cement as well as proteins. So they actually don't go through the membrane, but it actually cements them together. We can have something called a spot desmosome, which exists on the side of a cell, and that forms a small circle. So you can see here we have the intercellular cement and the proteins that they are calling the cell adhesion molecules that actually lock together those cells. We can also have something called a hemidesmosome that is in a half circle shape, and what that does is it attaches the cell to the basement membrane. So here we have the hemidesmosome. It's kind of got that half circle shape, and what that does is you can see the proteins actually run down into the basement membrane, which anchors that cell there. Desmosomes are very common in the skin, and what this does is it causes us to lose cells from our skin in sheets. For instance, like when you peel from a bad sunburn, that's why all of those groups of cells come off together, is because of the desmosomes that are there. Now, second characteristic of epithelial tissue is that the top, in other words, apical surface of the cell is exposed to either the environment on the outside or some sort of internal chamber. Now, this apical surface can have specialized structures, and that includes microvilli and cilia. They differ in their functions. Microvilli have an absorption and secretion function. Their purpose is to increase the surface area, and we typically find these in the digestive and urinary tracts. Cilia looks similar to microvilli, but their job is to move materials, and we find them typically in the respiratory tract. Here's a great visual difference between the two. The microvilli are actually these small projections at the top, for instance in here the red and the orange, whereas the cilia are much, much longer, so they would be like the yellow here in this other picture. So structurally they do look very, very different from each other, and functionally they operate different. Cilia moves materials, whereas microvilli increase surface area to allow better absorption. Epithelial tissue also attached to connective tissue underneath them through the basement membrane. And this is what helps to prevent our epithelial layers from floating on the surface of our body. Now, this basement membrane, like I said, it's not cells, it's a network of protein fibers, and they attach to each other through the hemidesmosomes. The basement membrane also acts as a barrier that prevents large molecules from moving into the epithelium from below. Epithelial cells also have to be continuously replaced because of damage or loss at the exposed surface. In some areas of the body, they may only survive a day or two. Sometimes they do last a little bit longer. For instance, the top layer of your skin usually lasts about 2 weeks. These are replaced through division of unspecialized cells that are located near the basement membrane, so they are well protected, and these are called stem cells. The last characteristic of epithelial tissue is that it has no blood vessels within them. If you've ever had a small scrape at the very, very surface where it hasn't bled, that means you haven't gone through the whole epithelial layer, and that's very typical of that type of abrasion. Because the blood vessels are located in the underlying connective tissue, only if you reach that layer will you bleed. So in the next segment, we will actually go through the classification of epithelium based on its characteristics.